one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, thank you. I hope we all had a chance to read the write-up that the Secretary of State's office gave us last week. I actually found it pretty interesting. And it kind of put my thoughts, I'm starting to get a feeling of what maybe we could accomplish here. You know, something, I like to find the areas of agreement when I'm working with people. You know, focus on that first, because the areas of disagreement will always take care of themselves, right? But when I was looking at this write-up, it made me start to think that in addition to policy matters in which we expect some disagreement, though some agreement as well, it seems like there's a lot of I don't want to say issues, a lot of aspects of the current statutes that ought to be, should all be able to agree need to be fixed. And so it should be easy to become, it seems to me, should be relatively easy to come to an agreement on some simple stuff like the question he brought up about the difference between candidates filing as a candidate and filing as a candidate committee. You mentioned that in the notes that you sent me too, where they have different reporting deadlines in a couple of instances. I mean, it seems to me that should be something, it should be relatively straightforward to bring into agreement between a candidate committee and someone running just as a candidate. Does that make sense? I ask that because when I'm speaking, it always makes sense to me. So I want to, yeah, so go ahead.
Do we require candidates to have a candidate committee? I mean, or not?
No, we don't.
We don't now,
Right.
but we don't define candidate committee in 664. So I guess my question is, do we as a group want to require candidates to file as a committee, or still give them the chance to file only as a candidate?
Yeah,
I don't understand the advantage or the disadvantage either way, but.
I was thinking about that. And you might remember that last year or the year before this, there was a proposal to require all candidates, including state rep candidates, to form a committee. And at that time, and I haven't changed my mind, I really don't think we should try to fit everyone into that box, because a lot of, we've got 400 state reps, and a lot of our campaigns are pretty simple to run and don't really require more than one person who can accept financial responsibility, fiscal responsibility. So my feeling is no, we don't need to require a candidate committee, certainly not at the state rep level. But I was thinking as I was reading these notes from the Secretary of State that, well, I still think if a campaign is on a large enough scale, maybe a state Senate race qualifies for that. By large scale, I mean really large amounts of money would all agree are substantial. I mean, I understand that some state Senate races can run, 100,000 or a lot more. I mean, to me, that's real money. Well, to me, a quarter is real money, but that's serious money where, as a candidate, especially running for the first time, you might want some people helping you officially that are familiar with the ins and outs of running such a campaign. So I think we should still allow the opportunity. So I think being able to run solely as a candidate or having a candidate committee still makes sense to me. But just picking on one issue as an example of something I think we should be able to agree on, having those reporting deadlines the same.
Right.
I think it's the two deadlines in the off year, the odd numbered year, where the candidate committees have to file a report in June and December, and someone running who's still registered as just a candidate does it in May and November. Why shouldn't those be the same? I can't think of a good reason. So that's something that I think would help reduce confusion, basically, on the part of the candidates and the people working with them. So there's one example of something I think we should be able to agree on. There's a number of others here too.
Right. So, I'm sorry, are you saying that the only times they would file would be, May and December?
No, I was looking at the table in this write-up
Oh,
of the
okay.
filing
Yeah.
deadlines, and it looked like there were only two that were different between candidates and candidate committees. They're on page 7 and 8 there of this write-up that they gave us. So on page 7, let's see, it looks like there's 3 actually coming up. It's too late to do anything about a June filing deadline for the candidate committees. That does not apply to the candidates at the top of page 7. So again, there's lots more to discuss, but just establishing the idea that we can find things we can all agree on. And my thinking is that would probably be a really good place to start. Maybe we'll get in the habit of agreeing. So those are my thoughts right now, the thoughts that were in the front of my mind after going through this.
Do you want to have, what do you think, Connie, on any other thoughts on candidates?
No. I mean, I didn't have a strong opinion either way. I never really understood the difference, why you would do it. I just felt like for my own race, I mean, it was so small, it didn't make sense to do a committee, and I wasn't going to raise a ton of money, that kind of thing. But, so I didn't do it. But
Right.
if you're running for Senate or Executive Council or Governor, I mean, you need somebody to do that. I agree with that. I just didn't know if we were trying to streamline things, did we want everybody to be a committee? But as long as we're making them report, I don't see that it makes that much difference. I can be convinced otherwise, but I don't know. Do you have any thoughts? You care?
I'd just like to review the argument for simplifying by having everybody register as a candidate committee versus the present form, which you said you prefer,
Mhm.
where candidates have the option of being just a candidate and not having a candidate committee. So there was that bill you mentioned earlier that would make everybody register as a candidate committee.
Right.
And
Yeah,
what's the argument for that? What's the argument against it?
I actually don't remember the argument for it, except maybe a simplification one, but I don't think it's that complicated the way we're doing it now. The argument against it, from my own personal perspective, was that it's a campaign that's, for state rep, a campaign does not have to be terribly complicated. You put out signs, maybe you put a few ads in, you door knock. We all know the routine. And to be required to find somebody else who will officially sign up and participate in that campaign is it's almost like another barrier to participation, which is,
Yeah. Can we make the filing dates the same? Is there any reason why we wouldn't make the filing dates the same?
for the reports,
Yeah.
I can't see any reason, and
I mean, that way they're all, from that perspective, then they're all the same
right.
and kind of,
And
there's no confusion.
in the discussion we had last week with the Secretary of State and Mr. Fitch, they seemed to think that would make sense also. They were bringing this to our attention as something that could be improved, I think. And again, this is just one example as I was reading through this. And I was really happy they gave us a handout, because trying to take adequate notes while listening, it can be difficult. So how would you guys like to were you here a few minutes ago when I was, when I was suggesting that we hold the next meeting 2 weeks from today? Yeah, okay.
I have another question or point
Yep.
about candidate committee.
Please.
On page 6 of the handout from the Secretary of State's office last week, just above the number 3,
Right.
oh, excuse me, just under number 3, reporting deadlines, which is, I guess, what we're talking about. The end of the first paragraph says this distinction on when the first report is due is another area where 664 is complex and requires a deep understanding of the law. Is that what we're addressing right now, or is this a different issue that's addressed in number 3?
We're addressing, I think, a specific aspect of the general issue of complexity when it comes to political committees. But right now, yes, in one particular aspect of that. There's other aspects that we could look at as well. Again, I was just trying to come up with an example to establish the point that we can agree on things. We know that's true, but. Mhm. Right. And based on my reading and my recollection of last week's meeting, there's a number of things like this that would, there are contradictions in the statutes as currently written that I think we could find some to remove. We were listening to the experts last week, and it was from the Secretary of State's office. It was clear there were aspects of the statutes that they're not quite sure what they mean, which is not a good thing. See, in my mind right now, I'm splitting the subject matter into like two broad areas. One is, of course, the policy questions, thresholds for reporting and so on. That's a policy matter. But whatever policies we agree on, there's a separate issue, which is whatever is in the statute should be understandable. Right. Oh, that's right. You're in that profession, so I'm sure you see many examples where things are not clear. Okay.
So can I take advantage of having the Deputy Secretary of State here for a minute?
Yes, you can, if she's willing to discuss things with us.
You don't, I guess you do have to, but
Ms.
we're trying to,
Let me introduce her.
okay.
Deputy Secretary of State Erin Hennessy. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Sorry for the surprise. Mostly, we've been trying to get the Attorney General's office to come and address us on issues with no success. So we'd like to enlist someone's help if that makes sense, and if they're comfortable doing it, in helping us reach out to the AG and have them come and do a presentation the way last week that Secretary of State and Mr. Fitch did. So,
I'm happy to reach out to their office.
okay, thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, we had a very good discussion with Mr. Scanlon and Mr. Fitch last week. And we know that we need to talk to the people responsible for enforcing the campaign finance system laws. In fact, we were, I think, reminded of that several times in that discussion.
Yeah,
So thank you. Any help would be appreciated.
and that's all I really wanted to know. That's why I
Thank
hated
you.
to drag you out. Okay, thank you.
All right.
Were there others in this memo that?
Well, you did send did you want to share this with the other members? But it's yeah, okay, sure. If you'd like to share it, sure. Representative Lane prepared a list of the things that caught her eye in reading the Secretary of State's write-up. It was not quite as organized. I made my notes on the write-up itself. Was there anything, Representative Muirhead, that you had particular interest in discussing today or approach you'd like to take?
Well, I agree with your approach, and
Okay,
I do think it'd be good to have a list of unnecessary complexities and sources of confusion that were highlighted by the Secretary of State,
Mhm.
Mr. Fitch, last week. And even if we had that list even prior to knowing whether we agree
right.
that every element of that list can be, corrected in ways that are commonsensical, that would be
Mhm.
useful.
Right. Okay.
Maybe that's what Representative Lane is bringing us.
Yeah, I mean, I read what she sent to me last night, and it was a good summary of her take on things like that, and mixed in with some policy matters. But I saw some amount of overlap between what she had picked up on and what I picked up on in my reading. All right. Nothing significant in the brief time you were absent.
No, I mean, I might have missed something on my list. In other words,
Oh, yeah.
this may not, I might have overlooked something. It was, if I did, it was not intentional. So,
Well, this is a work in progress. All right. So it was okay. So how would you like to approach this? I'm thinking maybe we take this right up and just do a once over together, kind of like we did with the definitions a couple of weeks ago. And I've got my notes on my write-up, and we've got your helpful list. That'll maybe
Okay.
help us focus. The first thing that kind of strikes me is the first line. We have 9 different types of registration for people involved in political activities. We've discussed candidate committees and registering as a candidate and shared our views on that. Are there any of those other 7 that seem like they could be streamlined or subsumed into another category to you guys?
I think political advocacy organization, if we work on what expenditures are, if we define expenditures
Mhm.
and independent expenditures, we might be able to eliminate those, and then how we look at what a candidate is. And you can look at the way the way I'm told is that in federal law, they look at what the major purpose of an organization is. And if the major purpose is supporting that candidate, then that you can, so it's basic, and then anything that's not a major purpose, and that would be the super PACs and those, you would have them record when they expend money or when they hit a certain level.
Mhm.
At least that's the way I understand it. So you could have the definition of a political committee just be much more general than what we've got here, and then tie it to what they're expending. And these are how people expend, and these are categories, at least when I read stuff about campaign finance, and I actually read a couple different state statutes just to get an idea of, you know, how they do it. And
Mhm.
it's not that different than how we're doing it here. But to streamline it, you would just make the definition of political committee as generic as you can and tie the distinction to either the major purpose of it or the expenditures and the independent expenditures.
Mhm.
But then, because a super PAC, at least, is a type of PAC. But a PAC is organized to support usually the candidate and is tied to the candidate. A super PAC is not.
Oh,
And so
okay.
you have to be clear about coordination and what constitutes coordination.
Mhm.
And I think that's what Ross was getting to, because he didn't like the super PACs coming in. He wanted to make sure that we had coordination, because it's not defined right now in our statute what coordination is. So I'm kind of rambling, but
No,
I think
well,
there's a
it's-
way to do it. I just haven't set pen to paper to try to do it yet.
Well, with what we're doing here, a certain amount of brainstorming is going to be helpful. Seems to me. All right. Now,
Kind of taking care of 2 and 3, right?
2 and
The
3.
candidate committee and the candidate. I mean, we know,
Well, there was one detail in the reporting periods that I thought should be straightforward to fix.
Okay.
And it mentions in a couple of places where, let me find it here. Where the language is, in one place, a couple of places in the statutes for what is reported by a reporting deadline. Let's say the reporting, you have to get the report in by the end of Wednesday. And in some places in the statutes, it says it will include all activity, reportable activity up to and including
right,
Monday. In other places, it says up to Monday. I think that's how
Right.
the 2 ways of saying it. And that's a bit ambiguous. I mean, up to including makes it very clear it would be through Monday. Up to might, strictly speaking, include only through Sunday.
correct.
So that seems like that's an inconsistency that I think should be,
Hopefully we
made
can agree
consistent.
on that, yeah.
yeah, right, exactly.
Wouldn't it be hard? Oh, it's at the bottom of page 7. Oh, in the RSA 664-6, Roman numeral 2-A.
Right, yep. It's footnote number 2.
Yeah, he
At the-
doesn't have it, so.
Oh, okay.
He's actually reading the statute.
664:6 Roman numeral 2 and 664:6 Roman numeral 1 are inconsistent. When I was filing my reports, I just assumed it was through Monday. And 2 days later, you file the report. I was not aware of this inconsistency.
Right.
And I think,
So do you want to make it include Monday or not? I don't, do people have time to, I mean, is that too much to ask? Maybe not so much for the larger campaigns, but for the 400 of us that don't have larger campaigns, is that, or do you want to cut it off on Sunday?
I don't actually have a preference. I just think it
Okay.
should be one or the other. I can,
Do you care, Russ?
So Sunday,
Let's do Sunday. And then there's a lot of different dollar amounts, and I guess we can talk about that at some point, trying to make the dollar amounts as consistent as possible. But we might not be able to do that.
right, when we start talking about dollar amounts, that's starting to be,
A policy thing,
right, and I'm not saying we shouldn't talk about them, I'm just saying, let's do the easy,
do it later.
the easy things. Yeah,
Okay.
do the things we think we're likely to agree on, because resolving an inconsistency in two parts of the statute on what the cutoff is, I actually think that's pretty important. There was an example of an inconsistency in the statutes back in 2000, I think it was 2017. There was a really severe winter storm on town election day. I think first Tuesday, oh, people remember that, right? And a significant proportion of the town moderators in the affected areas read one portion of the statute that made it sound very clear that they had the authority to delay the election, postpone the election because of severe weather. And there was another statute that stated that the towns were required to hold the election on that particular day. You all remember that. And the Secretary of State came down, Secretary of State Gardner. It was his controlling opinion that it was the latter. Had to be on Tuesday. So how long did it take were you in the legislature? Yeah. How long did that take? I was a selectman, and it took us, I think, most of a year
Right.
to get a bill passed where the selectmen had to say, yes, this was a valid election. Took 9 months, 10 months.
Yeah, so when I was a rookie legislator, and I had not been a legislator when that happened, but the next year,
Oh, it was the next year. I couldn't
I was
remember.
assigned to that subcommittee.
Uh-huh.
And we came up with a bill that supposedly fixed it, but that was a dance too, so, yeah,
Well, in the town election we had recently in early March,
it happened again.
it happened again. And the moderators had the clear authority to postpone.
Right.
It was a good thing because I had over 30 inches of snow. In fact, I was still digging out and couldn't make our postponed election law committee the next day. So anyway, there's an example of why consistency between the statutes is important. We all knew this, but I think of that every time I look at some seemingly minor point like this. And I see, I mean, there are some of us who do pay attention to details, and for people like that, where the details don't match up, it can be a barrier to getting involved. We don't want that. All right, so there's one. Okay.
So reporting deadlines, number 3 on page 6. I think that's what, Russ, you were reading, right? That first sentence. Yeah. Yeah, he was talking about, I think, Mr. Fitch was talking about how it's a two-pronged test. You have to form and spend. And he was do not have a duty to register unless and until the committee. So
I w-
I don't know the,
I will go through my notes before our next meeting and come up with a nice list like you did.
right, I just don't know how,
We're-
I think again, we could just say that when it hits a certain threshold, that's when they have to, and like you said, that gets into policy about the number, but can we agree that once we hit a number, when they, when they either hit a number of expenditures or donors, then they have to start reporting? Or is it just expenditures? Because if we're working on transparency, we're really trying to find out what they're spending, right? So if they've collected a lot of money, but they're not spending it, do we care? I don't know.
No, I know what you're saying. And I'm thinking, and I don't have a real solid opinion on this
Yeah,
yet,
I
so
don't
I'm just
either.
kind of
Yeah,
thinking out loud. I mean, they're both important. If uh, your thoughts on what was, the purpose of a campaign finance system, mine were a little uh, simpler than yours, but there was some overlap.
yeah,
Uh, and I'm still thinking this through, but the purpose of, we know that in our election system, just the way I look at it. Give me a second. I go back right to the root of the legitimacy of our form of government, which is it's laid out in the Declaration of Independence that the just powers of governments derive from the consent of the governed. And that's self-evident according to the founders. There's not something to discuss or argue. It's self-evident. You don't have to prove it. I like that. I like when they're making it clear where they're starting from. So it depends on the consent of the governed. And our election law system is how we go about ensuring we have that consent, right? That makes sense. But, what requirements does the election law system have to fulfill in order to do that? Well, I see two broad categories. Well, we need to make an accurate assessment of the sentiment of the voting public, the people who have the franchise.
mhm,
And we have to do it in such a way that we retain their confidence that it is accurate. And to do it accurately, well, one of the things required to retain the confidence is that this system be transparent. So, and by that, I mean people can readily understand what's going on. And I can see campaign finance as coming under that requirement, the need for transparency. And specifically, it kicks in because of concerns about undue influence. I think that was kind of at the heart of what we're concerned about. And particularly, we don't want there to be covert undue influence. If somebody is pumping enough money into a particular political effort, that the money itself might be influencing the actions of the candidate.
mhm.
I don't know that we can stop that, but the public should know about it. So that's how I see it here. Preventing making sure everybody's aware if there's a possibility of undue influence. So that's our requirement.
Right,
And the amounts of money involved, of course, that's where it gets to be policy. What is that amount of money?
right.
And there's room for reasonable people to disagree on that too. I think in a state representative race, for example, where we're making $100 a year before taxes, and I don't think there are very many of the 400 that are, or of the 24 senators are doing it for direct financial reasons. I think so maybe the threshold makes sense for those thresholds of reporting to be lower. Higher level, levels of races that involve more constituents for the candidate and hence more money to reach them. And those thresholds are different.
Right.
So the principle of having thresholds, I think we can agree on, but then it becomes a question of finding the amount we can agree on. And that
Okay.
I expect we could have lots of discussion on. We have in the past,
Yeah.
right? So I'm still looking for easy pickups here, I guess.
Okay.
One question, something that's unclear to me. What is the date range that applies to a given election cycle? We see that you had that question too in your list,
Yeah.
and I had the same question. I mean, I would like an answer to it. We hear about election cycle quite a bit, but I haven't seen a definition as to when a particular 2-year, we know it's 2 years because the elections are
Yeah.
every 2 years. When does the previous election cycle end? What date? And is that defined anywhere? I haven't seen it.
In our statute, no,
No.
election cycle or election, it's not. But I mean, for me, and I know that Ross, we talked about those concerns about paying off, loans and stuff like that. But we could do that the election cycle starts the day after the general election.
The next cycle? Okay.
The next, so the day after the general election and goes until election day. So that's the election cycle. What gets confusing, however, is what happens in that situation where you're still out there campaigning after you win and you get money to pay off your loan.
Mhm.
How do you, what money is that going to? Is that going to the new one or is it going to the old one? Or do we say if it's going towards expenditures that were made in, let's say, 22,
Right, I understand.
then it would be for the previous election cycle. If it's going to go towards 24, that's the next one, right?
Right. Yeah.
Then you'd have to put it there in that one as a donation. So it would, I guess, be for expenditures that were made during that election cycle. I think that works, but I don't know for sure. And I still don't know what to do with excess, but we can talk about that later. But that's one definition that I've seen, and it kind of also encompasses if you're doing the exploratory or if you're starting to, because people start campaigning well before June when we have to file.
Well, with a 2-year cycle, it's,
Yeah.
When does the campaigning really stop? Especially for the races with more constituents,
Yes.
state senate and,
Yeah. Yeah. In
And
theory, we're running now, but I'm not knocking on doors yet. So, but anyway, that was one that I saw. Sometimes they do it. I was looking at, like I said, some of these other statutes. I'll look at some of the other ones again and see how they define it. But that one kind of stuck out. It seemed easy
I
to do.
yeah, I was thinking about this also, and I understood the concern we discussed, the thought we discussed last week, which had to do with generating additional surplus after election day, which then is not accounted for in can be rolled over to the next election cycle. I'm not going to use the term loophole because I just hear that too much, I guess. To me, if something is within the law, it's within, I'm not a lawyer, so maybe I'm simple-minded on this, but if it's within the law, it should be considered within the law and it's not actionable by the government.
Mhm.
Now, people can have their opinion on it. We have a right to
Right.
opinions, but anyway, I understand the question we discussed last week about someone keeps accepting donations after election day and builds a larger surplus. Maybe that would be a way to approach it. If you have a campaign debt after election day, people should be able to raise funds to pay off that debt. If they can't pay off a debt with donations after election day, that could also be a barrier to people of modest means from participating. maybe it would make sense to say you can't accumulate any additional surplus after election day to roll over. This is just like the beginnings of a thought. I'd have to look at it from a lot of different angles before I concluded it made sense, but it's maybe an approach. If you have a debt to pay off, you can collect on the previous election cycle, you can accept donations until you've paid the debt off, and then from then on, they have to go into the next cycle, which would be the current cycle after election day. Okay. That might be an approach.
Yeah, that's, I think, kind of what I
Okay.
was saying. It would either be an expenditure or it was incurred, I guess.
Mhm.
In other words, you might incur it but not have yet paid for it. So it depends on how you define
Oh,
expenditure.
well.
But I think, I think we're thinking along the same lines.
Yeah, I would myself, and I'm not a lawyer. In engineering, we try to think logically too.
You do. Yes, you do. Some of my favorite clients.
Uh, To me, an expense is when you've incurred the obligation to pay the money. That's really the date of the expense in my mind. Again, I'm obviously not a financier. Anyway, that's maybe an approach that we could try on that particular issue.
Okay.
So the thought that the election cycle would end at midnight on election day,
Right.
and the next cycle then begins as far as campaign finance tracking.
Okay.
And I'm also looking for things that would not just that we could agree on, but that we could get the other 394 or 395 representatives to agree on, or a majority of them.
Right. And yeah.
And then there's another chamber of the legislature to consider. Well, this is my second year doing it. I will just an aside. I do think that bills that come through the New Hampshire legislature get thoroughly vetted. I mean, we look at them in many different ways, and
Yeah.
I think that's a good thing.
Oh,
That's obviously a good thing. All right.
okay. And then still going through his list on this memo. And then what to do with the surplus, I guess, is at the bottom of page 8, number 4. It's interesting, it's only a political committee. It doesn't say or candidate.
Page 8. Oh. Hmm. Now, what was it about that has your attention?
What was just an area that was in this memo that has some, on the next page,
Right.
goes through different complexities or issues, and how do we resolve it? And then if you have an excess and you roll it over, and you're allowed to roll it over, how do you attribute that? And do you have to attribute it? So say it's $5,000, do you have to look back and say, because the money is all commingled now, so you don't know who gave you that money. You don't know where did that 5,000 come? Did it come from several 1,000? Did it come from, a number of small donations? Where did it come from? And do you would have to attribute it to somebody to figure out what the limits are? If you roll it over, do you have to attribute it to somebody? Or do you just start with that campaign war chest and not attribute it to anybody, and that's where you start for the next election? I don't know, but I would think it might be a nightmare trying to figure out where it came from. At
Oh,
least
I don't think
the-
it'd be,
for the small campaigns, it would be,
it's not the least bit practical.
Right.
And I was thinking about this one as well. And I don't know that there's any purpose to it because the contributions they received in the previous election cycle that were above the threshold for, reporting the name of the person, that's still on record. So someone who was particularly concerned, and and the bigger campaigns especially, there could be, they can trace that back. The history doesn't just go away. They can look over a number of election cycles. You can look for patterns. You can see who were big donors in the past. So I'm not sure it's needed because that history is still there of who donated. Yeah.
campaigns, I just, trying to go back,
No.
I mean, would be, I don't know what you guys think, but I think it would be really hard.
Well, I'm talking about the public has access to
Right.
the records from the previous campaign cycle so that the
Yeah.
who the donors were, that knowledge still exists in an accessible
For
form.
that. And then just start a clean slate for the next election for the
And you,
contribution limit.
yeah, I think so, yeah. hmm Because again, those previous records of who were contributing monies we think we agree surpassed the threshold of people should know who did it, that still exist. So I don't think we need to split it out. And plus, it's totally impractical. There's no particular benefit because the knowledge still exists who contributed.
And I think he was talking about you had to get it to 0 in order to file a final report. And is there some reason that we're doing that? Why do we have to get to 0?
I'm thinking there's two aspects to the campaign finance system reporting. One we've discussed, which is trying to make sure that the public has knowledge of where there could be what we call undue influence. Another reason I think is also that the fact that a campaign has to account for the funds publicly in reports is protection for contributors. Whereas I donate
Right.
$100, big money, well, for me it would be,
It would.
right, for all of us, I think. But it assures the fact you have to zero it out and account for how the money was disposed of.
Mhm.
For example, you can zero it out if you have a surplus and you donate it to another campaign or you donate it, I believe, to a charity, a recognized charity, right? So the people who donated now know the money was used for a proper purpose that they had in mind when they donated it. So in New Hampshire, at least,
Right.
if you build up a big campaign war chest, you can't go, you're no longer running for office. You can't go spend it on a vacation, on a cruise,
Right.
right? So I think that's the second aspect of it and why it's important to zero it out before you close it.
If you roll it over into, I guess you'd have to set up a new campaign for the next year, even before you know if you're going to run again. If you roll it over to that, I guess if you decide not to run,
You'd still have to
you'd have to
zero it
figure
out
You'd have
and-
to zero it out at that time.
in one of the fashions allowed by the law. And that's also a protection against corruption.
Exactly, that's what I was
I think it's an excellent protection against corruption. you can't build up a huge war chest and then I'm not running anymore and spend it however you like, which would be corrupt. If the money, I'm speaking, generally and loosely.
No, I agree.
So that's a good reason for zeroing out a particular campaign account, seems to me. So. Yes, what's on your mind, Representative?
Just looking at the Secretary of State's list that he shared with us last week, there seemed to be a number, like a lot of things that this working group could look into. One, just taking them in order, that a candidate committee is undefined. And so on page 1 of 11, number 2A, last sentence, if retained as a separate type of registration, quote, candidate committee should be defined. So if we want to retain that, we should maybe write a definition of it that we could insert into the law. 2, the second thing that I see here, there are different reporting requirements for candidate committees and candidates. You've already mentioned that. Candidate committee has to register within 48 hours of promoting success or defeat. A candidate only has to register when expenses are greater than $1,000.
Right.
The two things should be, the reporting requirements should just be the same for these two things, probably. Third thing, on page 2 of 11, in the discussion of exploratory candidates. Exploratory candidates do not need to register at all. They can raise and spend without limit. And the Secretary of State's memo says to us at the bottom of the 3rd paragraph on page 2, exploratory committees need to be defined. Exploratory candidates committees should be defined and the reporting obligation should be made explicit. Last sentence of the 3rd paragraph. One idea is well, there are different solutions to that, but this is just on the to-do list, so I won't segue into solutions, but a third item on the to-do list. Fourth item, turning to the next page, 3 of 11, number 5, political committee major purpose and electioneering. There's a $2,500 trigger here, receipts or expenditures totaling $2,500. I think there's an ambiguity because the candidate committee has $1,000, or the candidate has $1,000 trigger. So we have just a different number here without getting into the question of what the number should be. Just, we might want to it'd be good if there were a consensus that the numbers should be different if they are different, or would ideally be the same, whatever the same number is. There's this distinction on page 3 between these two types, major purpose electioneering, major purpose not electioneering. Whether it's not electioneering, the threshold is $5,000 in a calendar year. And so again, you have a different number, and it's not, and I guess there's no definition in the law of how to determine the major purpose.
Okay.
Next to-do list from this, page 4 of 11, item 9, political advocacy organizations we discussed. I think that there's a need to clarify this category if we wish to keep it. And there are further thoughts in the memo on page 10, items 7 and 8 on political advocacy organization, where the memo directs us to RSA 664-2, section 22. And there are just ambiguities there in this in this one of 8 categories, political advocacy organization. So, again, it has a $5,000 trigger. Maybe we just need to sort out, do we want this to be in the law, this category? And is it what, it'd be good to know what purpose it's serving.
The entity of political advocacy organization.
Yeah, yeah.
That's the kind of thing that when I read that, I feel kind of wary of, because I think we're all very adamant about the free speech rights protected by the First Amendment. And sometimes my antennae just start to quiver about whether we're verging on that, like a political advocacy organization. We've got a right to say whatever we want about political matters too. And we have a right to associate with other people to do that. So
we should read go back to that 664-2, section 22 with the real, what the Secretary of State's memo speculates on page 10, number 7. This, I'll just read that to you. Definition of political advocacy organization is not easily understood.
Right.
I think that might be an understatement. One reasonable construction of the definition.
what page are you reading from?
Oh, page 10, sorry.
What line?
Item number 7 on page 10.
Okay. Thank you.
Which just directs, it's a continuation of this discussion, political advocacy organization, but it directs us to the parts of the RSA where they're not defined.
Oh, right.
One reasonable construction is that a registrant this is kind of a catch-all thing. If the other 7 things didn't catch you, this one is there to catch you. So it's a registrant can choose this only if you don't qualify as any of the other types of registration. So maybe that's what the purpose is. I'm just speculating here, but anyway, it seems like we have some defining to do if we want to keep that.
Yeah, there was another political committee type on page 4, item 7, political committee voluntary registration. Is that?
I think that's
I
they
need to understand.
They register even though they don't have to.
Yeah, they don't have. Well, they don't have to
but-
report.
But they don't. But for
I
some, for
I understand
some
what
reason
it
they
is,
do
but why do we need that?
So there are these other
I don't know that we do.
later in the memo.
Yeah.
There are these cases where entities or people register, though they're not required to, sometimes because they're receiving a contribution and the contributor wants to know that the contribution has been received and registered.
Well, I read that.
Okay.
And I understand it, but I don't know how to put this nicely. Is that really our problem that we need to address in the law? I don't know. I don't have a real opinion on it. It's a question. Really.
Yeah, good. So
It's really a question.
Maybe the system could allow people to do it without it being in the RSA. The next thing on the to-do list is that fiscal agent,
Oh, right. Versus
financial agent, fiscal agent, and treasurer.
Yeah.
And 664.12, 664.7. We have different terms floating around, 664.3 and 13. Secretary of State reports on page 6 of the memo, we received questions on the distinction between financial agent, fiscal agent, treasurer. Clarifying these roles and any intended distinction would be beneficial. If there's no meaningful distinction, why not use a single term? So there's another next item on the to-do. So the 8th item on my list of the to-dos in this memo arises on page 8 of the memo, where the reporting requirements for reporting deadlines are being discussed, and there's a question about the reporting requirements for political committees that don't have contributions or receipts in excess of $1,000.
that's on page 8.
Yeah, page 8 at the end of the first paragraph. Some filers find the requirement
Right.
and process for these zero receipt expenditure reports
Right.
confusing. just of note. So if we want that to be confusing, if we want the law to be confusing, we should keep it as it is. Maybe if we want to fix that. Then there's the next paragraph, there's a way in which committees are reporting twice. So the end of
Right.
that paragraph says reporting twice is the current practice in order to comply with the law. So probably don't really need to make people report. The intention isn't to make them report twice.
Yeah, I had,
Political
I had the
committees.
same question in my notes.
Yeah, so that's a mop-up area.
Mm-hmm.
And page 9, it looks like on item 4A at the top, this has to do with closing out a political committee.
This item A.
Yeah,
let's see,
exactly.
there are, right, hang on.
So
Yeah,
at
that-
the end of
that's-
that, it says the plain language would mean that even though they've never had to report
Right.
at the deadlines leading up to and following the election, they would nonetheless have to file a report disclosing all receipts and expenditures to close the committee.
Right, because they exist as a committee, even though
They
under
never-
another definition.
Yeah, so it's
Yeah.
a small thing, but it's a source of confusion. And then
Mhm.
finally, the last to do thing is raising funds after a cycle if there's no debt in the campaign. And the Secretary of State's memo on page 9 down on letter D asks that we make more explicit the prohibition against post-election fundraising in campaigns where there's no
Right,
debt.
we were just discussing
Yeah, I
that a
know,
little
I
while
know.
ago, which,
So that's my list as for what's on my mind of the to-dos that come out of this memo, none of which I think necessarily involve, essentially contested ideas and concepts and philosophies.
is that something you would be willing to take a few minutes and type up as a
Yes.
working
Yeah.
working document?
Yeah,
that
I'll
we
do that.
can,
Yes,
uh,
happily.
Yeah, I was gonna ask that question is, who's maintaining, like, writing all of these? Do we just start having a working document and then insert stuff, or? I started doing it only because that's how I think.
Well, that's how
Yeah.
I think. I just hadn't got to it yet.
Yeah,
I mean, I made my notes on
okay,
the write-up. I think, I will make a similar list myself. I need to, so I can think about it.
okay.
I think we can share these. This is not an actual document in the public sense because it's just notes.
Okay,
Uh,
And it's I look ahead, there's a lot there, and some of those things are very, very require a lot of concentration and study. And maybe this committee picks out, 2 or 3 of them, and tries to do on the idea that fixing something is better than fixing nothing, even if we can't fix everything.
Well, what's that saying? Progress, not perfection, right? I mean,
Right.
make things better where we can.
hopefully.
Well, that
Yeah.
implies it in our opinion. Of course, it'd have to be an opinion shared by a majority of 2 legislative chambers too to go anywhere.
Mhm.
So, yeah, that's what I was thinking when I read through this and considering the policy matters that we could also discuss.
Yeah,
As far as, I don't know that we're under, I think there's a natural deadline for what we're doing here, not natural schedule. What's the date by which legislation would have to be filed for next year? I don't remember. Is it December? Does it,
yeah.
Right about Labor Day.
September? Oh, it is that soon. Okay. I thought it was later.
I did too. Really? That early?
Well, I think you can file the LSR
Wow.
or something, and then the actual bill doesn't have to get filed in December. No?
No.
Oh.
I'm glad we have you guys here. Thank you. Wow, that's soon. Yeah,
mean,
I
even if
just
we were
don't
to
have it
work
with
in
me.
the Fall, recommended legislation that we handed off to the next election law committee to introduce. I mean, that would still be good work. We don't
Right.
have to necessarily get this in
Well, actually, if we got to the point where we had notions that we thought were ready to introduce as legislation, that would be
Yeah,
the schedule, but we still can produce a useful work product in the
Right.
form of a report
right. And
laying
then-
out more recommendations than that
Yeah,
and the reasons, and supporting
right,
material to support why we think that, of course.
right.
And
The Deputy Secretary of State raised her hand with I think she might have a comment.
we would welcome your comment, Deputy Secretary of State. Would you like to come up to the microphone just so we can all hear? Okay,
Erin Hennessy, Deputy Secretary of State. This is just a trick from my old legislative days and
Mhm.
not as my current role. But if there are things that you know you want to change, you could put a bill in September. And if you want to continue working, you could amend that bill.
That's
Right.
what I was wondering,
Yep.
yeah.
So,
Thank you.
yes,
Thank you.
Let's put file a bill
She said work.
declaring
Wait a
the
minute.
resolution that July 4th be a sacred day and
No, then it would be non-germane.
other,
Well, I'm,
One way to do it.
I'm, right. I'm still thinking we can come up with at least a list of topics that would improve the current state of the statutes. It would be helpful to people who are dealing with campaign finance.
Right. Does this subcommittee end at the end of this year, or would it continue, then we could continue on and put in that amendment?
I don't know. We can find out, though.
Right.
I don't recall that there was an end date included in the notice of the
think-
subcommittee.
Yeah, I don't know if there was I don't know if there was, I know we had a report, in the bill, there was a day to report by, that was just for a report.
Right.
But I don't know when they appointed the subcommittee, if they had that same date. So I guess we can clarify that.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah, there may well be a rule on that. I don't know it.
okay,
We can find out, though.
all right.
All right. Let me make a note on that. I'll see what I can find out. Does this subcommittee have a defined end date? I will find out. Yeah, another area on my mind has to do with exploratory committees and the requirement for it. That implies a certain formality, but anybody can consider whether they want to run for office ahead of the filing period, and they can talk to people about it. And people can promote their own ideas through media, paid media even, without having to ask permission. So it doesn't sound like we have a definition of exploratory candidate, do we? I mean,
It's not in there.
and it would
It's
have to
u-
be
it's-
one that
it's
wouldn't,
used, but it's not really clearly
right?
defined.
And if there were one, it would have to be sure it doesn't step on people's free speech rights.
Right, and I think it was Ross's idea to kind of just have the limits just be for the entire election cycle.
Yep,
So
without distinguishing.
without distinguishing. So that is another way to do that, and then we don't have to define. But we would have to define when you become a candidate, which we have to do anyway. 'Cause
Which is defined for,
they wanted us to define when you become a candidate. So I'll take that on. But when do you start running? And the Secretary of State suggested the date that you file, but that's in June, and you've probably already been collecting money and campaigning and doing stuff, particularly for the larger offices, well before the date that you file.
sure.
So I'm not sure that date is really capturing what we want to know. So I think, but it would be in an election cycle, so it would catch it if we define election cycle, I think. So if we go with Ross's idea, we'd have to bump up the limits, but it would still be the same amount of money. It's just not divided into those three: exploratory,
Right.
primary, and general.
And that would be simpler. And I'm not sure why we why we need to or should distinguish,
I'm not sure either.
especially if something is difficult to define. Do we really need to
We
define it?
We might get some ideas on that idea. But I like it. It's simple.
Mhm.
That's where, I mean, maybe there also could be one registration category, just catch-all category. If you're, spending, raising money to advance a candidacy or measure measures
Right.
and so forth,
Then you need to register.
then you can register as a catch-all. You could be candidate, exploratory candidate, candidate committee. All those terms could be in the same registration. You don't have to pick one.
Yeah.
You just pick a list of things.
Right, that's what I was.
And the same
Yeah.
reporting requirements apply to, to
So-
every registrant.
If in whatever date, January of 2023, just picking it at random, you want to start publicizing yourself to people as a candidate, whether whether broadly or more limited, in a more limited fashion, and represent yourself to them as a candidate and collect funds from them for that stated purpose.
Mhm.
Uh, I got to think about it more.
Right.
But
And I think the idea is if you do that by spending more than $1,000 or by raising and spending, whatever the number is, 1,000, 2,500, 5,000, whatever
Yeah.
you want to set it at. If you raise or spend X, then you have to, register and report.
yeah, you can take contributions privately from friends and supporters. They could say, let me give you $50 to
Right.
to encourage you to run for office. It's not really until you start this.
As a candidate, it's only when you spend 1,000 that you have to register and report.
Right.
As a candidate committee, as soon as 48 hours after you start any activity, I think you have to register. And the reporting requirements are a little different. It's raising or spending for a candidate committee.
And
But
people
I
who-
think those could just be made the same. And the thresholds, the raising, spending, and they could
Maybe
just
it should be the
for
same
all those things.
for both. Right, including the when you need to register. Yeah.
And it
You
could
know.
be throwing out a number of $2,500. If
Huh?
you collect a few checks from friends, you're not going to hit
Well, you're just a
$2,500.
regular
Yes.
And to say for what it's worth, the FEC has a very long statement on defining what we're talking about.
Right.
The
Differentiating
what, Jerry?
FEC between testing the waters versus campaigning. I defy you to understand it.
Yeah, we might pick up useful thoughts from that. But,
Yeah, it's a long, very interesting thing, what you can and can't do.
but my immediate reaction is that we would not want to bind ourselves to something that complicated
Yeah.
at the state
whole
level.
thing is about the whole length of 664.
You're kidding me.
Pretty long.
What?
He said,
If you
he
just
said it's
test-
the length of
testing the waters
664.
for possible candidacy. Yeah, it's pretty long.
If we just had publicly financed elections, we could solve all of these problems.
There you go.
Yeah, that would keep the big money out of politics, right? The people who print money. Poli-
I'll type up that list and get it.
yeah, that would be useful. I'll do the same. I'll type one up too.
I guess,
Are people comfortable working in a Google Doc, in a shared doc? Have you done that before? If you haven't, I'm not going to introduce you to it, but it's
I
a
have.
fairly easy way of having multiple contributors.
I'm not ready to do that yet myself.
I've
I,
done,
I, I would, just the way I work, I would prefer to have people share their thoughts in an independent document that I can look at locally without getting into the cloud. It's just,
You like track changes?
well, I'm not feeling like I'm at the point where I want to share it.
Forget about it. First yoga, then Google Doc.
First what?
Yoga.
Yoga. Yoga.
We're gonna get you into yoga and then we'll get you into cooking. One thing at a time.
Is that fantasy life of yours again? Yeah. Wow, that's very active. I hope it's an enjoyable one.
There was one thing that we talked about was about the required disclosure of who's paying for things, like on the signs and whatever. And do we need the address, and do you, or do you just put the reference, if there's a website, put a website on there?
That's already allowed as long as the website includes the contact information. If you put a sign out, you put your website on it, and the website has that information, that's allowable.
Okay,
That's my clear recollection. If I'm
Okay.
wrong, tell me, but
okay.
I'm pretty
'Cause,
sure that's
um,
right.
then what do you do about, so the things about, do you have to put it on buttons?
No.
We only put it on signs, right? And then there's the whole thing about digital ads, which Ross was talking about too. What do you do with digital ads?
Yeah, I don't have any feeling for that at this point.
Okay.
And as far, when it comes to signs, practically speaking, how do you enforce that anyway? Seriously, I mean, I've known people, I know people
Who,
at the local level at least, who aren't even aware of the requirement. And first time when I ran for selectman, I went back and pasted addresses on all my signs
yeah.
because I wasn't aware of it when
And that's under, yeah, I mean, that would be under enforcement. I think
right, good point.
we need to talk about, and I was surprised to see, I think I saw something in here that said, if you haven't filed everything, you're not supposed to be, you're not really, I think they say you
Oh, I
can't,
saw that listed in your notes.
you can't be nominated or elected if you're behind on your last financial, and that has not been enforced, I don't think.
I saw that in your list. And
I was just surprised. I was like,
well, so
but
that
it's
wasn't,
already in there.
that wasn't something you were proposing. That was something you thought you saw in the in the
It's
statute.
it's in
Is-
here, yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I bet that would be very challengeable in court.
Yeah, 664-9.
Oh.
But I knew I saw it. Yeah, no candidate shall be entitled to the nomination or election until the sworn itemized statements required to be filed by him, or they left out her, in his behalf have been filed as required by RSA 664-6 and 7. Yeah, but
Oh,
that's,
interesting.
yeah, because that's definitely not been enforced.
Well, that would be a good question for a representative of the Attorney General's office,
Right.
along with my question about how you enforce putting contact info on a sign
Right,
or mailing from out of state.
right.
Remember that was a concern
Yeah.
you had.
So, yeah.
Okay. Well, we have time. Yes, if you'd like to ask a question,
Or
I'll make,
comment. Okay, yeah.
well, having allowed a member of the public to ask a question, I have to make sure that all viewpoints get the opportunity now. Since this is a work session public meeting, but not a public hearing.
Just a question. I know you had said you're looking at a total rewrite, but then you had this different ideas presented, and I was just wondering if you're thinking that the final product would be one bill with a total rewrite, or if you're thinking that, Ross Berry might introduce a bill that mandates the online system for certain races and that you all co-sponsor it. And then the other idea around, changing the definition to make it clear on, the date that you file a report, is another bill, and that you sort of delegate, like Representative Ward is going to take it up to and including and delete including, and that's a separate piece of legislation that you kind of are thinking of, each different person prime sponsoring a different idea, or are we thinking one complete and total massive bill?
Uh, I can only answer for myself. My function as chairman, I think, is obvious, is to arrange things like scheduling meetings and making sure we all have an opportunity to speak our thoughts. That's, facilitate the discussion. But speaking for myself, I don't have that level of organization in my thoughts yet. Having looked at the number of seemingly minor issues in the current statutes, my feeling is we go after the things we can agree to fix, and the idea of a total rewrite sounds too ambitious to me. And how we would organize the actually trying to make changes by submitting bills. There may be some things we can agree on that are simple enough we could get something prepared for the next legislative year. But I think probably should keep our focus on the stated purpose of the subcommittee, which is to prepare a report on recommendations. That makes sense to you guys? Makes sense to me, but okay. I've spoken for myself. Now others, we're going to hear from the others. That's an interesting question.
I mean, I'm open to different strategies once we get to the point where, if we get to the point where the committee as a whole is in agreement about a number of desirable changes, then it just becomes a question of how to advocate for them and persuade our colleagues. And
Right.
sometimes dividing things up into different bills when each one requires a different argument makes more sense, because you can make the discrete arguments rather than making 16 arguments about one bill. But if there's a series of grammatical fixes in different sections of the law, then you may bundle those all together, and it would be a true housekeeping bill, unlike most of the bills that are described as housekeeping bills.
Yeah, and this is only my second term, but I've often heard that the New Hampshire House does not like what some call omnibus bills that have a number of topics that are not closely related. And I have to say, that's my feeling on the matter too, personally. So what Representative Muirhead was just describing, I think, is consistent with that feeling as well. Representative Lane?
I guess omnibus to me means when you have things that are not related to each other. So if all of our stuff would be on campaign finance
True.
in this chapter. So I don't think of that as an omnibus bill. I think that of a long, complicated bill. I'm concerned about the definitions, so that if we don't get the definitions passed that we want, are these other bills going to make sense with these existing? So
Right.
part of me is like, we need to clean up some of these definitions or add them. So if we don't pass them as a package, I'm concerned that we may not solve the issues that we want to solve.
That's the way I look at things. I mean, we all have dealt with
Yeah.
difficult, complex problems. And I know in my background, sometimes you're lucky and you can split these components into parts that are independent of each other, and so address a series of simpler problems. I think that's what you're talking about. I'm sure it's true, and it must be true in most fields.
I'm not sure that unless we get all the definitions right, that we can necessarily
I-
piecemeal it. So we need to kind of think through if we're going to do it that way.
So you're
I would think-
prioritize,
yeah.
you're stating what you think would be a priority for which pieces we should deal with first
Right, and I guess.
as a basis for the
Because
rest.
I
Okay.
left last week thinking we were rewriting the whole thing, because I said, we're talking
Yeah.
about a wholesale rewrite, and Secretary of State nodded, and I was like, oh boy. So
You said you thought what?
I was
bo-
like, oh boy.
Yeah,
I mean, 'cause
right. As
it's-
in, that's a
Because
big
there's a
thing
lot
to,
of stuff in here that
yeah.
we've not talked about.
I
So
know.
if we, so I'm not sure, but I was thinking we were doing an omnibus one, but that is intimidating.
And I
I mean-
think, go ahead.
Representative Lane, your describing a situation where the different parts of the bill are logically connected
Yeah,
and where you need to redefine things or clean
Right.
up definitions in order to get to the next thing and
Mhm.
have, so that would be that, then there's a reason to have things bundled together. And the less there is a reason to bundle things together, then maybe we don't
We
bundle them
don't,
together.
okay.
But let's be open to whatever strategy makes things most transparent to voters, to our colleagues, and seems just most fair and effective, whatever that is.
Yeah, that makes sense to me too. Do you have any thoughts on this, Representative Ward, at this point? You don't have to, I mean, or it's-
The only thing I learned as a government major in college was to keep your options open.
right. So I think that is as complete an answer as we can give to your question. We're working on it.
It's
We're-
only 25 pages. It's not like it's a big deal.
Excuse me?
The 664 is only 25 pages. It's not very.
I'm gonna dump it into Chat GPT tonight and ask Chat GPT
Yeah,
to
just
revise it.
revise the whole thing, and we'll have it by
Yeah.
Friday.
Okay. Well, I did open it to questions from the public, so I am obligated to make sure that if anyone has another question, they have an opportunity to ask it. So that looks like, okay, sure. I mean, yes, please. And identify yourself to us. Oh, really? I've tried it out. It's not that good. Yes, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Would you press the button to get the red light on? Did you? Right in front.
I knew that.
There we go. Perfect.
My name is Corinne Dodge, and I live in Derry. I don't really have a question, but I want to thank you for the way you're working together with one another. Campaign finance reform has been an issue for me for a long time, ever since I joined Open Democracy Action, and I am so happy to see Republicans and Democrats working together for campaign finance reform. That's really, it's not a question, it's just a statement.
Well, thank you for that comment, and you're welcome. I'm speaking for myself. And I'm sure the areas where we'll have vigorous discussion will present themselves at some point, but reasonable people can differ. All right, I'm going to, speaking as chairman, then I'm going to, this brief period of public comment is now closed. And thank you. I appreciate the interest. I do. We don't have to go to noon if we've run out of things to talk about now. I'm not urging we stop, but I'm perfectly willing to. But
I mean, I think I have my marching orders and
Mhm.
it'd be, I don't have anything else on my agenda this morning.
and I've actually acquired an action item. Oops. No.
I was thinking that maybe we could contact, the national, what's that legislative service, the National Conference of Legislate, I can't remember the name, the acronym, but they have materials and stuff that I thought we might find useful, at least as far as addressing some of these definitions
Mhm.
and some of the issues that other people have run into, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Would you like me to do that, or do you want to do that?
Yeah, I think that would be, I would like you to do that. I think
Okay.
it would be useful for me too.
Okay.
If we can
Oh,
mine what
thank you.
other people have done for the things that will work here in New Hampshire, right? Why? It's been my experience, it is easier, it's often easier to recognize a good idea than to invent one.
Yeah. Yeah.
Easier to copy the wheel than to reinvent
That- the wheel, that's
Yeah.
right. Or improve the wheel. Not plagiarize, right?
Well, once an idea exists and it's out there, it's hard to, it's subject to use. All right. So do we, amongst us, feel a need for further discussion today? Okay. Then we can, if someone would like to, we'll be semi-formal about if someone would like, should I ask for a motion to adjourn or just assert my,
So
I'll tell you what.
moved.
so moved. Okay. We have hereby adjourned at 11:38. a.m. 2 weeks, same time, same place. I'm going to go schedule it right now.
Well, it's a question of better than informal, better than formal.
So have
I wanted to give this.